Welcome to the patch 1.10 video review for Legends of Runeterra. Today we'll be talking about the latest balance changes happening for this patch. Just like in previous videos, we'll very briefly touch on the developer notes. Then we'll be talking about the card changes, and finally, we'll talk about the new changes coming to the standard Gauntlet format. I won't be reviewing the rest of the notes like the expedition changes or the bug fixes, so feel free to check out those other changes in the patch notes themselves. I'll leave a link to that in the video description below. As usual, I'll have timestamps in the video description and as a pinned comment below for anyone that wants to skip around to specific cards. Let's jump into it. As always, things open up with some developer notes from the Legends of Runeterra team. This time around, it's short and sweet, however. We will actually be getting more changes in the very next patch 2 weeks from now, in addition to the changes in this patch. The next patch will have changes that focus more on the Targon region. So spoiler alert, no Targon cards got changed for this patch. What we can expect next patch though are adjustments to Aurelion's Soul's level up requirement, some type of buff to Grandfather removal, and adding some type of escalation to Hush's repeatable cost. Now let's talk about the card changes, starting with the champions. First up, we've got Ezreal, whose level up requirement has been increased from targeting at least 8 enemies to targeting at least 10 enemies. I basically called this one. No, I didn't put out my thoughts anywhere on social media or any other content I do about my Ezreal nerf predictions. But for the past 3 weeks, ever since Riot stated that Ezreal would see some type of change when Call of the Mountain first released, I was thinking about how they would go about it, and I figured the simplest change would be to increase the amount of targets needed from 8 to 10 for leveling up. I really couldn't see them doing any other nerf without fundamentally changing how Ezreal works. Something I don't think Riot wants to do unless absolutely necessary. I'm not sure what the future holds in store for Ezreal. A few players will undoubtedly say that Ezreal is now dead, but I'm a little more optimistic. Dedicated combo decks should exist in this game in my opinion, and Ezreal is one of the best champions to build a dedicated combo deck with. I think we just need to wait and see. Next up is Lee Sin, who now costs 4 mana. His level 1 is now a 3/4, down from a 3/6. His level 2 is now a 4/5, down from a 4/7. His level up requirement has been increased from casting 7 spells to 8 spells, and his champion spell has changed from Dragon's Rage to Sonic Wave. As someone that's experimented with Lee Sin a lot in the past, I was very nervous about this change. The cost reduction is amazing. Lee Sin going down to 4 mana is going to make it a lot easier for players to be able to play him and protect him with spells using their leftover mana. Personally, I was expecting him to be reduced to 5 mana with no other changes, but this is what we get instead. Lee Sin's biggest problem was that at 6 mana, he often took up your entire turn to play him, making Lee Sin a bit too slow. Oftentimes, I just waited to level him up before playing him, which was usually after round 6. The problem with that, however, is he was much less impactful by that time, even at level 2. He just didn't have enough comeback potential when played that way. That said, I think the health decrease seems a little too sharp. It's obvious that with this change, Riot wants to give us more incentive to play him at level 1 while protecting him with spells and working towards his level up at the same time. But I'm a little afraid that Lee Sin will be much easier to get rid of. Activating the barrier on Lee Sin is going to be more important than ever in my opinion. But then again, that is something Lee Sin decks should be good at doing anyway, as you need to run a lot of cheap spells to support him. Lee Sin's champion spell being changed to Sonic Wave might be the real winner for him though. Going from a slow speed spell that costs 7 mana, which can be countered by several spells, to a burst speed spell for 2 mana that has good utility is insane. You don't have to worry about your spell being countered and losing your champion for good anymore. I don't want to say that Lee Sin will be the new go-to champion for combo decks since that's how he's usually played, but it looks like he'll finally be a compelling option if you want to build a combo deck without Ezreal. Moving on to the followers and spells that got changed. We're starting off with War Chefs, who is now a 1/3 instead of a 2/3. This was a surprise. As good as War Chefs is, I wasn't expecting the card to actually be nerfed, but it is. I'm not really mad at this change though. In fact, I kind of like this nerf. War Chefs has been another one of those auto-include cards for mid-range Demacia decks, and I think this card does a bit too much too early. War Chefs did help to establish Demacia's identity of dominating the board early with superior stats, but I just think this card did its job a little too well. Hopefully this will open up Demacia mid-range decks to try other 2-drops. The one archetype that will probably struggle the most is the Bannerman decks, however. Other Demacia decks can pull from 2-drops in their other regions. Bannerman decks like Scouts will have to make slightly more drastic adjustments if they want to keep their Bannerman synergy intact, assuming War Chefs is bad now, of course. Scouts have been running only Misfortune as their lone Bilgewater card for a while, so it's possible they may have to go back to running 6 copies of Bilgewater cards by playing a 2-drop from Bilgewater. Next we have Flash of Brilliance, which now costs 3 mana, again, instead of 4 mana. As someone that liked when they changed this card from 3 mana to 4 mana, I am actually glad this is going back to 3 mana. I did say before that this card felt a little too powerful because of the RNG behind it, and I was initially happy about the nerf due to this card's high roll potential and creating feel bad moments for the ones facing it. But recently, I've been experimenting with Heimerdinger, who was also reworked at the same time Flash was nerfed, and the combination of both changes as a whole felt like an overnerf. So I'm happy that Riot is dialing back on their previous changes by putting this back to 3 mana. Heimerdinger is probably one of, if not the least played champion in the game right now since his rework, although I still think he has some untapped potential with how his turrets work now. I've also played Flash and Lee Sin decks in the past, but I don't think we'll be seeing that in the meta going forward. There's just much better regions to pair Lee Sin with than Piltover and Zaun at this point. Next we have Overgrown Snapvine, which is now a 5/3 instead of a 4/3. Pretty good change. I don't think this will make a huge impact in the ranked meta, but the Snapvine combo style players can rejoice as their decks got a little bit better from this change. Snapvine can now trade with other popular 5 health units and won't die too easily since players are still resistant to playing 3 damage removal, and understandably so since most of it is pretty expensive. Next we have Crackshot Corsair, which is now a 1/2 instead of a 1/1. Corsair has rarely seen use up until this point, so this is a decent buff. I still don't think Corsair is compelling enough for a deck like, say, Pirate Aggro to actually use, but it's possible there is still another viable Bilgewater aggro deck that focuses more on plunder instead of it just being an afterthought, especially given the next card we'll be talking about. The vast majority of the time, the decks that did play Corsair would just leave it back on their bench instead of actually attacking with it, similar to Misfortune. I think for the most part that will remain unchanged, but now there are a few turn 1 scenarios where you can attack with Corsair and it will live. Outside of that, Corsair no longer dies to 1 damage ping effects, which is another plus. Next we have Jagged Taskmaster, which is now a 2 mana 3/2 instead of a 3 mana 4/3. This is an interesting change, especially with Crackshot Corsair also getting buffed. Riot stated that they were adjusting this card to make it easier to utilize in its core deck, which really gets me thinking, what core deck are they talking about? Because Taskmaster hasn't seen any serious rank play. The biggest problem this card has is still there. You don't get the buff on your 1-cost units that are in play until after you deal damage to the Nexus, which means sometimes you'll play this card after you've already attacked. At least that's been my experience messing with this card, and Taskmaster never felt good to play post-combat as it just felt like a wasted opportunity to deal more damage. But anyway, back to this core deck idea. I've tried this card with Professor Von Yip in the past and basically utilized this card as Von Yip copies 4, 5, and 6. So maybe that's the deck worth going back to? Or maybe even a more generic Bilgewater aggro deck that runs Piltover and Zaun cards and is much more focused on plunder. Regardless, I think you are pairing this with Corsair now if you weren't before. Possibly with Misfortune now as well, since this isn't clogging up your 3 mana slot anymore. Next we have Yordle Grifter, who will now only create a warning shot when Allegiance is activated in addition to nabbing for 1. This change I am very happy about but it might be too little too late. The only reason I say that is because Bilgewater decks that run this card have started dedicating more of their card slots to Bilgewater cards to actually make their deck an Allegiance deck, whereas before they weren't doing that. Decks like Tempo Sejuani, back in the Rising Tides days, would often run 9 or more Freljord cards because they only cared about the warning shot from this card and not so much the Allegiance effect. That hasn't been the case though in this meta with the different flavors of pirate decks running around. They are very all in on activating Allegiance on this card. Overall, I still think this is a very good change and brings it more in line with other Allegiance cards. I just think it would have had more impact if it happened sooner. And finally, we have Cygnus the Moonstalker, which is now a 5/3 instead of a 4/2. I don't think this card necessarily needed a buff, but I'm not going to complain about this one. Actually, I take some of that back. I do think a health buff was probably needed, but not a power buff too. I feel like Cygnus did fine as a finisher in Nightfall aggro decks, although some players have since switched to running Atrocity or just not running 6-cost cards at all, which I can't say is necessarily wrong. Anyway, Cygnus will continue to be appealing as a curve topper for Nightfall aggro decks, but I think Atrocity is still going to give him competition even with this change. Finally, let's talk about the new update that's coming to the standard formats for gauntlets. The way the standard gauntlets will work going forward is that you'll start off by picking 3 different decks that you'd potentially like to use. After you lock in your 3 decks, you'll queue up like normal, and when you're matched up with an opponent, you'll enter what's called a pick and ban lobby, where you'll get to look at the regions and champions of your opponent's decks and ban one of them from being played. Your opponent will also get to do the same to you. Afterwards, you pick which of your remaining 2 decks you'd like to play for the match. The matches will still be 1 game only, not a best 2 out of 3. There's a few caveats when it comes to selecting your 3 decks though. You can't have any champions duplicated between your decks. So for example, you can't run Leona in more than one of your decks. You must have different region combinations for each deck, and you can only have a maximum of 1 deck that doesn't contain any champions. I'm actually really excited about this update. This basically feels like Riot is testing the waters for future in-game tournaments for Legends of Runeterra, which I think will eventually lead into organized play for the game, also known as esports. One thing that some players might not like is that this change potentially locks out new players that are free to play and don't have the collection to make 3 different decks yet. But I see this as a minor drawback given how generous this game is, especially in the first 2 weeks that you play it. Also, we need to keep in mind that Singleton Gauntlet isn't going away. That will still be around, which means this new standard gauntlet won't be in the client every week, giving you more time to build your collection to a point where you have 3 decent decks if you're new. But yeah, I'm super hyped for this standard gauntlet change. Not so much because of the change itself, but because of what it could mean for the future of the game. And that's it from me. The rest of the changes that weren't covered in this video are some bug fixes, changes to some of the expedition archetypes, and the introduction of a new lab. So feel free to check out the patch notes on those in the link in the video description below. If you guys made it to the end, thank you so much for the support. If you enjoyed the video, let me know by hitting the like button below and leaving a comment. I appreciate constructive criticism as well, since I'm always looking to do things better. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to click the notification bell below as well. Also, feel free to check out all the other places you can find me at in the video description below. You'll find links to my Twitch channel, Twitter, and we even have a community Discord that you can join for free to talk about Runeterra or get help from others. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.